Good evening. I'm Harriet Hamasi, University Librarian at Brown, and thank you for being here tonight. Many of you may already know Jo, but I am just getting to know her, and today I found out that she grew up in Texas, as did I. So I can tell that Jo, I can tell now that Jo is from Texas because she has on cowboy boots. So Jo Guldi is a newly appointed assistant professor of history at Brown, who earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard, studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, and earned her PhD in history at UC Berkeley. She also had postdocs at University of Chicago, and just last year finished a postdoc at the Harvard Society of Fellows. So we feel very fortunate to have Jo here. Her research interests lie in the history of capitalism, land use, and computational tools that visualize large amounts of data. So tonight's lecture should be actually quite wonderful. And in 2011, Jo published her first book, Roads to Power, published by Harvard University Press, and she's now working on another book, The Long Land War. I understand that much of your talk tonight, Jo, is on this new research, and we look forward to hearing from you on this. Please join me in welcoming Jo.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Harriet, for organizing this and for hosting this, this series at the Digital Scholarship Lab. Harriet has been responsible in convening this room, this series, and other events and gatherings on campus to draw together scholars who are interested in new frontiers of information of all sorts. And it's been a privilege to plug into that some, and I'm hoping that this conversation will inspire other such dialogues moving forward. So I want to start this talk by showing two maps that on their face could not be more different. The first, on the left, is the Great Trigonometric Survey of India, a map of empire from the God's eye view. It was an immense centralized undertaking led by experts who used abstract mathematics to accurately measure land in order to further tax a people already subjugated by violence. The second map, on the right, is a Google map of toilets functioning and not in a Bombay slum, executed by Harvard students of public health in 2012 and covered by the New York Times. In contrast to the first map, the second is an unofficial product of volunteers working in the service of the poor. The second map deals with those most bodily and practical functions of human waste. It's the product of many-to-many collaboration, driven by 21st century technology that puts editing the map in the power of anyone with a cell phone. Yet these two maps are far more similar than they appear if we consider the social structures behind them. In the former, learned British colonists, schooled as geographers, made a map in the service of empire. In the latter, learned American students, schooled in the administration of public health and development economics, made a map suggesting where the state should intervene. In neither case did the maps originate with the inhabitants. To the extent that both are artifacts of what historians term rule by experts, the maps are very much alike. But there is another tradition of participatory map making, one where the maps are made by the people who live in the place for purposes that originated with the inhabitants themselves. Consider this map of environmental observations related to Inuit territories in Alaska. Maps such as these have been, in recent years, successfully used to bring court cases against polluters, mobilizing the evidence of hundreds of grassroots observers. They suggest that, indeed, technology has put the tools of governing the globe directly in the hands of the people, and their existence confirms the assessment that, moreover, participatory maps can save the world. So I'd like to stop here and tell you a little bit about what sort of a historian I am and how I came to this sort of a project. Tensions between expert rule and participatory governance are at the heart of my work as a historian. 2 years ago, I published a book about the role of infrastructure in making an empire, which foregrounded the story of the use of maps by expert rule. In talking with engineers about the implications of these stories, I've come to believe that historians should not merely point to the wreckage caused by expertise past, which 40 years of academic research has now totally substantiated. Rather, the historian's aim should be at least as often to tell stories that enable solidarity, witness of the fact that hidden forms of past freedoms lie concealed around in the world around us still. I'm interested in what happens when humanists and social scientists collaborate with friends in computer science to become builders of new infrastructure for community, a path increasingly attractive to scholar activists like Liz Berry of Public Laboratory at Columbia, or Tara McPherson, the author of Vectors at USC. About a year ago, attracted to stories of self-government, I came across a relatively unknown history of bottom-up mapping. Hand-drawn maps such as these were used by Marxists in the 1980s to give control over cities in the developing world to landless squatters fleeing from colonial plantations. For anyone familiar with the story of maps in the Western world, any story of how maps served revolutionary counter-movements is startling. And I became intrigued and spent much of the last year in these activists' archives, by which I mean their broom closets, reading about the intersecting histories of global movements that developed these maps and ways of deploying them to democratize control of land and water. I'm going to be telling you the story of what those archives said. But first, why is bottom-up mapping so extraordinary? Well, to begin with, it departs from the entire tradition of official mapping. Since the origins of the cadastral map in 16th century Europe, maps have been a tool of centralized administration and colonial rule. By the 17th century, European maps were helping settlers to lay claim to the lands of other peoples around the globe. By the 19th century, expert civil engineers and urban planners were using maps to evict poor families from neighborhoods that had already been identified as sources of working class radicalism. Where maps have been genuinely used to mobilize the management of territory by the poor, that action had the consequence of reversing the story of empire itself. So this is a story I'm going to be telling you about the undoing of empire. It is also, therefore, a global story, mirroring a world riddled by conflicting claims to the land. In an era of empire, most parts of the world had been at some point colonized by someone. In the post-war 20th century, post-colonial movements were as widespread as empire had been. The scale of this scene can be glimpsed in this map, which is auto-generated from the digital version of my archive using a toolkit for analysis, Paper Machines, that I developed in 2012 and about which you can learn more at papermachines.org. The brighter places, you see these two circles here and here, these are places that are mentioned more frequently in the newsletters of the participatory movement that I digitized and scanned and that my algorithms help to read. They're looking for place names that the algorithm can find in the gazetteer. And every time they find a place name, that gets brighter. So you can see, this is a story about the United States and about the United Kingdom and about their conversations about India. But there are also blue hazes here around Brazil and Peru and New Zealand, and also in Nigeria and Namibia and Kenya and Ethiopia. This is a global story. The activists I'll be talking about move between meetings in London, Bombay, British Columbia, Chicago, Yugoslavia, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, and the Appalachian Mountains, making maps wherever they go. Now, I'm not the first historian to have noticed that 20th century social movements have been global in the extreme. Consider Mark Kurslansky's characterization of 1968 as the first year when mass media were able to enable youth movements around the world to explode more or less simultaneously. Those same media served other movements that emerged around the same time, including the participatory movements for mapping that I'm going to tell you about. So around the world, indigenous people and development workers were all using media to communicate about the possibilities of maps for a revolution. And as this is a relatively unfamiliar story, I'm going to sketch the plan here in brief. Conversations about democratizing powers of technology go back as far as literacy itself. But experiments with crowdsourcing data go back to at least the 1930s. And I will begin there with conversations about power among radicals at the heart of British Empire and how those conversations were absorbed in America. This part of my story is a Hegelian journey, moving from east to west around the globe, from Britain to her former colonies, following the course of empire. But in the heated years after 1968, people in the developing world began to conceive of how technology could serve a new philosophy of participation. At this point, the directionality of history is reversed, as residents of the former British Empire began instructing British radicals about how to undo empire's work. Then, we'll see the first modern use of a participatory map, and this conversation circumvents the capitals of empire altogether. It was tribes of Cree Indians who created the first participatory map, influenced by many conversations elsewhere. Their success convinced many other activists that maps were useful tools. And by the 1990s, governments around the world were dedicating money to the promise of the crowdsourced map. Only at this moment will we end on the internet in 2005, when the techniques of this decades-long movement acquired at last a digital platform, recycling the tools of indigenous people into new form. At that point, we will be able to tell what a participatory map looks like, what happened to participatory mapping after 2005, and whether maps really can save the world. My story starts with the end of an empire that had united the globe and then lost it in the throes of a democratic revolution at home. On the eve of the Second World War, Britain was rife with experiments for reconceiving of data collection. From 1937 forward, the mass observation movement asked 500 untrained volunteers to anonymously record the conversations and behavior of strangers on the public street. The movement's founders were intent on spreading a popular movement for resisting fascism, and they saw decentralizing the powers of data collection as a possible avenue for mobilizing latent political energies. Elsewhere, British cartographers influenced by the writings of French radical Frédéric Laplace organized mass mapping experiments as a tool for synthesizing public knowledge about unemployment and market opportunities. In both cases, the labor of the many was chosen to augment the data intended for expert use. The lasting legacy of these experiments was two new tools, the survey and the hearing. Overturning structural exclusions of race and class was already the intent of both. One of the earliest advocates of the urban survey, Patrick Geddes, conceived of the survey and hearing as a remedy to class bias after years of running a settlement house in Edinburgh. As early as 1945, American planners at the TVA designed hearings to allow Black communities to call a halt to urban clearance as they were moved from plantations in the South to new settlements around the Tennessee Valley Authority. In 1951, Geddes-style surveys and hearings factored into the design of the Michael Reese Hospital on Chicago's racially embattled South Side with the intent of better serving the 85% Negro population of the neighborhood. The hearings such groups organized were still relatively new techniques for reforming the bureaucracy. Urban planners who instigated them marveled when hearings filled up City Hall with people from all walks of life. The civil rights movement took these experimental strategies and turned them into a mandate. In the United States, the Model Cities Act of 1966 urged the formation of citizen groups for repeated hearings. In the United Kingdom, various planning acts ordered local governments to factor participation into city structure. As the experts debated what participation meant, they looked beyond the hearing and the survey to issues of power itself. Sherry Arnstein, a social worker in Oakland, California, published the first concrete manifesto for a philosophy of participation in the Journal of the American Planning Association in 1968. Arnstein, then facilitating Black-directed cooperatives and schools in Oakland, encouraged planners to consider their work within a mandate of restoring agency to those it traditionally excluded from the economy. Participation without redistribution of power, she wrote, is an empty and frustrating process for the powerless. The article, A Ladder of Citizen Participation, offered a critique of agency, of who was allowed to make decisions in urban planning process. Arnstein denounced both survey and hearing as mechanisms outdated already, forms of co-optation, participatory in name alone. In contrast, she held up actual participatory co-ownership and self-direction in the form of the community-directed school and worker-owned cooperative. These institutions, she argued, should replace expert direction as the model for a new generation of institutions forming the city. Now, Arnstein was a community organizer invited to write for an urban planning journal, and she thereafter disappeared. But her article, The Ladder of Citizen Participation, became seminal and was distributed around the world. And I found it in the back of archives, Xeroxed in the middle of Bombay, still being used there. Immediately, the impact of the journal was absorbed in urban planning. And a new generation of planners, jolted by Arnstein's denunciation, turned back to the drawing board. Working in the political theory of Habermas and the sociology of Herbert Gans, they filled the planning journals of the 1970s with a literature on how personhood and collectivity could be mobilized to create a truly participatory city. Capitalizing upon wider theories of civic society, the public sphere, and privilege, they offered a new synthesis of ideas about inclusion. By the 1960s, the word participation was coming to mean something new, grounded in reopening previous exclusions of gender, race, and class. Now, no planner was more seminal in this new wave of theory than John Friedman, a student of both left-wing anti-racist Rex Tugwell, the director of the TVA and a sociologist who exposed the lynching epidemic in the American South during Jim Crow, as well as a student of right-wing economist Milton Friedman with only one N, both of whom were then teaching at the University of Chicago. John Friedman's first employment out of Chicago was at the Tennessee Valley Authority, where he witnessed firsthand the ineffectiveness of high-minded consultations with Black families about to be moved on from their former residences. Drawing upon both the anti-racism of Tugwell and the libertarian individualism of Milton Friedman, John Friedman proposed a new vision of American democracy characterized by participatory process. In Friedman's vision, open deliberations, styled on the old-fashioned New England town meeting, would come to moral consensus in envisioning future cities. Urban planners would then operate as the sibyls, translating these consensus processes into real form, giving plans back to architects who would in turn shape the city, but only taking instruction from participatory process. And this new age, an age of transactional planning, would grow up from the grassroots. Friedman deplored the foregoing age of the rule of experts, which included the era of the hearing and the survey, in which participation almost always, he wrote, signifies participation in someone else's plans. Instead, Friedman endorsed a new vision aligned with Arnstein's mandate to redistribute power. His conclusion called for a diminished role in his own profession, where urban planners would no longer analyze, they would merely facilitate visions coming from elsewhere. The process of societal guidance, he wrote, is too important to be left merely to experts. In action, participation had a limited record of success in both US and UK. Beyond professional circuits of urban planning and social science, most bureaucrats preferred to still pursue participation in the benign form of hearings, polls, and citizens' boards. And all of these institutions worked to silence the voices of the least privileged, as those were the ones least able to afford the time to make meetings across town. In Britain, Sporadic nods to the new model appeared in projects such as the London Dockland Scheme, where cutting-edge planners scheduled in community meetings. There as well, locals never achieved the political power necessary to redistribute resources. Participatory planning, in other words, was already dead by 1978 in both the US and the UK. As early as 1972, one group reacting to public pronouncements of a new age of democracy entitled its report, "The Participation Swindle." Yet participation had a totally different reception in the global South, where organizers were already eager to correct institutions received from empire. Starting in 1972, a dozen Asian scholars began meeting at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. They pulled together organizers of worker cooperatives and women's groups who began comparing their experiences of how institutions could be refashioned to devolve power downwards. Through the 1970s, members of this group joined up with other organizers, and meetings were held in Toronto, Yugoslavia, Venezuela, the Philippines, Korea, Australia, and the Bahamas. The people assembled in these international conferences were united by their commitment to overturning the rule of experts and investigating not merely the theory, but also the practice of participation. Organizers influenced by Paulo Freire were increasingly aware of how particular kinds of knowledge, including literacy itself, were used to dominate colonial populations. They too quoted Arnstein and began to theorize new kinds of government, whereas one activist wrote, "The community becomes the decision makers while the officials support the process." Participatory organizers relied upon the lightest of appropriate technologies, paper itself. Pamphlets, workbooks, manuals, and collections of case studies circulated at these conferences, gluing the loose network together into a community. They eschewed maps or any other tools that smacked of expert knowledge, preferring quick descriptions, 3-page articles, and regular updates. The facilitators, they boasted, wrote little, preferring to spend most of their time in settlement, village, and slum. For the organizers were less interested in theory than in a new kind of process. Drawing on Freirean methods, participatory organizers shaped meetings so as to ensure that women, the elderly, and minorities had a voice in community meetings. They concentrated their energies on shooing away men who tried to interfere with women's consensus-making process, or trying to move away adults who were trying to tell the children what to think. The organizers searched for other habits of mind to fit their goals as well. Participatory research, one organizer explained, entailed skills such as interaction, empathy, and trust. Participants worried about the organizer's power to promote conversation, so they relied upon the self-effacement of the facilitator to undo the expert privilege. The organizer, they wrote, must avoid trying to become the leader of the group. As one pamphlet explained, the organizer should disappear in the process of facilitation. Another article urged practitioners to present themselves as neither leftists by wearing jeans, nor as bourgeois by donning a tie, but to aim instead for a minimum of personal property and gadgetry. So they emphasized a mindset of humility at the base of dealing with data. Empathy and modesty would take the place of rigor and science as the methods of the modern sociologist. This was a philosophy the opposite of expertise, emphasizing, as one activist put it, a loss of complete control by the researcher. And a new list of proper tactics circulated, including being unimportant and listening. One set of mimeographed instructions drove home the point in all caps. Don't lecture, for God's sake, and don't interrupt. Ideas about overturning Western pedagogy and the hierarchy of experts found deaf ears in the majority of institutions founded upon governance and economic growth. The budding movement of educators in developing countries resonated with questions of many bureaucrats and institutions under the United Nations, who had seen patterns of exclusion reduplicated firsthand. And these individuals were eager to appropriate new strategies for democratizing their global work. So the participatory movement found especially energetic allies among British theorists of development with ties to radicalism, who were acculturated from generations of British liberalism to rethinking the use of data. At the newly founded University of Sussex, Economist Dudley Sears argued that the practice of foreign aid, with its linkage to charity and Western investors, did little to build up industries at home. Sears, author of the Sussex Manifesto, espoused a vision of economic development grounded in appropriate technology, indigenous technology, and housing for all. This was a vision of development supported by the UN and Food and Agriculture Office, but increasingly at odds with large-scale industrial farming and infrastructure development as proposed by the World Bank under McNamara. Above all, the Sussex vision foregrounded social and cultural solutions over econometric ones, and this bent made Sussex a home for those rethinking technology, data, and the role of participation in development. Sears' complaints echoed those of Indian critics of British Empire. From the early 20th century, Indian nationalists had warned about the dangers of dependence on British investment capital, urging that India's economic development take place upon the adaptation of cheap local technologies, such as the spinning wheel for making homespun cloth. In the 1960s, E.F. Schumacher translated these conversations for engineering departments in the West. First world engineers and third world farmers could collaborate, he argued, in designing cheap intermediate technologies that would advance less developed countries on the road to industrialization. The Appropriate Technology Movement, or AT for short, embraced the hope that informal governance and small-scale technology could decentralize wealth and so solve systematic economic exclusion. Researchers identified various technologies to retool for global distribution, including cheap toilets and irrigation pumps. And here is a pump. This is a rowing pump, so you sit back and you row, and the water comes up. And this is an engineering designed test tower for the many different kinds of pumps. So they're going to go all the way down, and then the engineer up here can decide which of them is working the best. In the eyes of Sears' younger colleague, Robert Chambers, the most problematic of technologies was the survey itself. Surveys and surveying knowledge, including the whole of the new punch card computer systems growing to buoy them, consumed a growing amount of researchers' time in the social sciences, Chambers complained. Echoing the participatory movement, Chambers argued that facilitators' time was better spent face-to-face with villagers or politicians changing social reality. Development program truly committed to appropriate technologies, Chambers reasoned, would reject the social science survey and the journal article in favor of direct action. The problem thus became one of finding a correct technology to change things, and Chambers began to contemplate the power of drawings like those members of the participatory movement had already made in their literacy classes. These pedagogic cartoons were receiving new scholarly endorsement by the AT movement. And by the 1960s, much of the appropriate technology movement had focused upon the limits of shared ways of seeing, demonstrating visual conventions of linear perspective in the West and suggesting more universal representations appropriate to global learners. So these are various charts explaining charts to people who have never seen them before, and this is the kind of work that the graphic design part of the appropriate technology movement is into. This is a poorly designed poster where you need certain kinds of graphic reference or maybe a good imagination to realize that the rat is being put out of its misery. But people from many more cultures were able to understand the logic of this poster. At the University of Sussex, development officials began to offer new training to participatory leaders in making diagrams showing how visual aids used well might become universal intermediaries between peasant consensus and policy change. English development theorists at Sussex also theorized about uses of walking in community. Walking with locals was necessary to correct biased opinions made from traveling only good roads in rich districts, wrote Robert Chambers. And he was paraphrasing here early 19th century radical William Cobbett, whose first Penguin paperback edition had just come out in 1967. Cobbett's ideas about the importance of walking as a tool of political critique were photocopied passed out to students and republished in development newsletters at Sussex in a nod to forms of English radicalism past. Following Cobbett, Sussex organizers promoted community walks as methods designed specifically to help outsiders see at close range several items of interest and relevance which they would otherwise miss. Objects of attention might include traditional indigenous technologies, medicinal plants, and animal fodders. The community walk for gathering data was itself a retooling or appropriate technology version of the transect survey, which was Alexander von Humboldt's tool for walking in a straight line up a mountain while identifying ecological zones. And here again, participatory organizers retooled a technique of data collection, which professional biologists would be used to, for their own purposes. Instead of using it to identify different zones where the flora and fauna all look the same, the participatory organizers would take a team of villagers around a mountain, walking one side of a watercourse and then back along the other. And in the course of these walks, they would develop consensus about local plants, local history, and infrastructure, including zones of social exclusion laid out in the landscape. And for them, transects were a tool of aligning the outsider's worldview with that of the local. So these Sussex movement methods, replacing surveys with community dialogue, implementing diagrams as a tool for collective discussion, and using transect walks to engage the community about consensus around the local landscape, these were disseminated around the world through international conferences like those that unified the participatory movement and the translation of a movement materials into new languages. The University of Sussex threw a conference around the Sussex Toolkit, now under the name of Rural Rapid Appraisal, or RRA, in 1979. And they threw another in 1980, and there were legion textbooks and organizers trained by Chambers himself circulating around India and other parts of the developing world by the end of the 1990s. Critics of expert management as these movements were, and dedicated to rethinking the development process, none of them before the late 1970s had yet begun to retool the map. The map was, after all, one of the foremost objects of colonial governance. Who would think that the map could be a tool of radical reclamation? Well, Native Americans did. And the fact that it was they is striking. Of all of the peasants that have been evicted, displaced, or indebted into leaving their land, the Native Americans of North America had lost their land repeatedly in events characterized by force, fraud, and regular reversal of legitimate contracts. And perhaps these experiences had made them more aware than most of the powers that maps could have in other hands. So in another corner of the former British Empire, Cambridge geographer Hugh Brodie, working with the First Nations group in Canada, came to understand the map as a potential tool for documenting evidence of ancient inhabitation and rights to land. Brodie encouraged natives from the Cree and Dunza tribes to draw out hunting tracks and traditional place names on a map. Tribes had already approached the Canadian government complaining about overdevelopment and pollution from expanding mining works encroaching onto their territory. And the promise of the map was its ability to work with property law in government courts. A crowdsourced map the Cree tribes found was a document that could alter the rulings of judges and the plans of government economists. It was a rich 500-person detailed case that the natives, far from having died out, were still inhabiting land that their ancestors had inhabited continuously for generations. Faced with these maps, judges tended to rule in favor of the tribe's sovereignty and against logging and mining companies that claimed a right to government lands. And just so you understand what's going on, these are the original maps. These are the hunting lines. So hunting lines had been deeded. There are specific legal instruments set up in the 1920s to allow only hunting rights, surface rights, while the land remains public. But what Brodie was able to show is that the specificity handed down from one generation to the next of these lines meant that if you zoomed in, they sort of marvelously didn't overlap. So you're talking about a very, very detailed, nuanced information about territory of a hunter who knows that this is his ridge and that is somebody else's ridge. And it's the specificity and the number of these drawings that in 1977 allows this to become part of the official record and part of the process of ruling in favor of tribal sovereignty. And then this is a later map. This one is made with GIS, and you can see there's a lot more going on here. By the 1990s, First Peoples of Canada are among the most numerous GIS users around the globe. They've trained, they're the biggest consumers, they're buying all of the programs up, and this is what they're doing with it. Some of these are place names demonstrating that our people were here. They have specific names for specific places found nowhere else in the world. Some of these are fur-bearing animals. You see the fox, wolf, raccoon, hare. And then there are berries, medicine, and other minerals. Now, the most recent versions of these maps, neither you nor I have access to. That's because this is important local information. And the privacy regulations around these maps mean that they need specific kinds of data regulation, which might not be available through Google Maps. You might want to hold back certain kinds of knowledge which are available only to the shaman of the tribe, and then you might want to make that available if you're going to court. So these sorts of conversations come out when you're talking to anthropologists who have worked on these court cases, when they're starting to think through the data architecture that might be necessary for the maps of the future to really work for these purposes. So at last, participatory methods has settled on a tool that could be used to synthesize grassroots conversation and the use of those conversations as a tool for overturning colonial alignments of power. Within a few years of the Canadian map, participatory organizers in Bombay were writing excitedly about the Cree experience in their newsletters. Soon, organizers were experimenting with participatory mapping in India. They, too, made maps of local squatter settlements and argued with the city about formally recognizing occupation, a step that would mean inducing the government to call off projects for evicting the poorest residents of the city and bulldozing their slums. Elsewhere in India, squatters organized for land rights, road maintenance, and getting municipal governments to clean out clogged sewers. A map-driven movement for control over the city had begun. Conversations about the participatory conferences had already congealed about land. This was, after all, the India of the 1970s, when campaigns for land reform were waged in every state, battling to overturn the colonial legacy of land monopolization that India had inherited from the British. Alongside literacy, feminism, and cooperative movements, the participatory research conferences overflowed with meetings about land rights, water rights, and organizing on behalf of tenants. And these meetings generated a global sharing of techniques and ideas well beyond the Cree maps. So my favorite story here is about John Gaventa, then director of the Highlander Research Center in Tennessee, which some of you will recognize as the center responsible for training Rosa Parks. In the 1970s, Gaventa organized a rent survey of the Appalachian Mountains that proved that the highest rates of absentee landlordism in the country kept Appalachian miners one of the poorest laboring populations of the United States. The survey was motivated by Georgist thinking about how rents are the primary way that a landlord class keeps the poor impoverished. No matter how much the poor organize for higher wages, those wages always get reabsorbed by a landlord class of owners in the form of rents. So similar thinking was widespread in India, and Gaventa met with excited organizers at the participatory research conferences of the 1970s and 1980s. In 1984, Gaventa was invited to Tamil Nadu to present the Appalachian Land Survey. The trade unions and literacy groups who attended saw in the survey a model for renegotiating land ownership patterns in Indian farms and cities. So these early experiments with tenure analysis reminded activists that the map had always been a tool for establishing legal rights in territory. As the Cree experience had shown, maps could potentially create a powerful reversal of colonial hierarchies that structurally excluded the poor and racial minorities from the governance of their own land. Participatory maps gave communities the tools with which to analyze the administration of their own territory and argue for adjustments suited to their own needs, adjustments that often looked like creating new public spaces through the power of common property law, or restoring traditional common rights to forest and aquifer. Maps were used to reestablish commons across the developing world. In Thailand, indigenous people used styrofoam maps to lobby for control over their ancestral territory. In Gujarat and Ethiopia, indigenous communities came up with cooperative systems for patrolling their woodlands and communally harvesting wood. Other projects specifically worked on community ownership of water. Indian NGOs worked with poor farmers in the participatory management of watersheds. Maps documented the exhaustion of local water aquifers and pointed out where hand pumps needed to be repaired. The map became a tool for facilitating consensus around a maintenance and repair schedule in these places. And armed with the tools of map making, poor communities undertook urban planning on their own. In the slums of Sri Lanka, communities met and decided in participatory debate that they valued equality and public space. Settlers then visited every site in the area, measuring with a tape and recording with a pencil their own map of the settlement. They'd redrew the map of the neighborhood with 1/3 of the land blocked out for open public space. And they decided to institute a redistribution of land. So they resurveyed every squat in the settlement, taking away space from the larger properties and giving space to the smaller ones. The entire community looking on in the process to oversee whether a powerful householder was not trying to take a little bit more than his due. Housing lots were redistributed to match the squatters' demand for equality. Sri Lanka held up the project as a model, and it was turned into the basis for other community initiatives elsewhere. Beyond land and water issues, maps were used to monitor domestic violence, disease, malnutrition, farming, and sexually transmitted diseases. Sometimes they were a vehicle for activism where participatory methods raised up the voices of women or the backward castes. Sometimes the maps merely enabled community dialogue and the creation of a new consensus about which crops were best for feeding local animals. But even that kind of consensus in the era of the Green Revolution meant circumventing the opinion of expert biologists and the loan systems handed down from the top to the bottom via banking and loan strategies designed around certain stocks of seeds. So organizers continued the search for technologies appropriate to the undertaking. One example, in the 1980s, Indian organizers developed Rangoli mapping, which we see here, which used the colored rice powder traditionally used for making apotropaic threshold symbols during Diwali and other festivals. In their hands, Rangoli became an appropriate technology for drawing on the dirt where markers and paper were scarce. Participatory facilitators also experimented with techniques that would allow conversations about population growth, wages, and climate change. Some thought that aerial mapping could start dialogues about the larger ecosystem. Others experimented with asking the village to draw maps in time, designed to show the village 50 years in the past and 50 years in the future. Maps thus became tools for debating Hardin on the tragedy of the commons and contesting Malthus on population growth, putting the analysis of these warnings and claims onto the table for debate within the village. The maps gained a reputation for success, in part because of their track record in creating reform where they were applied to a clear target. In cases that targeted legislation against a corporate polluter, the maps were extremely successful. In Tamil Nadu, participatory maps allowed neighbors to identify a local tannery that was polluting water to the detriment of fish populations. In Louisiana, maps helped a poor black community suffering from high rates of cancer to sue the local chemical company next door. Maps helped some communities to self-organize around small-scale programs like preschools, well maintenance, or street lighting. Maps protected native peoples' lands in Madagascar, the Himalayas, and the Philippines. Transferred to GIS, native maps from Canada are now being used to protect the area from tar sands developers. When crowdsourced maps appeared in the early 2000s, there was no question that they aligned with the needs of the poorest people in the developing world. And this is Beaver Lake Cree Nation territory in Canada, and all of the colored, the red is the nation's First Peoples territory, and all of the colored patches belong to the various petroleum interests described here below. Participatory mapping grew into an international endeavor promoted by NGOs around the globe, fostered by the UN and the World Bank, and eventually embraced as national policy by the government of India. Robert Chambers was sought out in the 1980s and 90s by Indian students who saw in his methods the possibility of retailoring Indian democracy. By the 1990s, participatory mapping had spread around the world and become one of the basic tools of international development. Despite these successes, however, there were implicit weaknesses in the mapping movement that made it vulnerable to events on the outside. Participation had been widely adopted by institutions, governments, and NGOs as a means of cheap development without commitment of resources from above. And this same cheapness made fragile the democratic potential of the participatory map. As bureaucrats came under pressure to cut budgets, among the first qualities of participatory mapping to suffer was the lapse of Freirean methods. Maps alone, as a technology stripped of support, could not create the village dialogue dreamed of by organizers in the 1970s. And that dream had rested on other kinds of support, including adult literacy, paid organizers, and legislative support for worker cooperatives. Those quantities were vanishing along with faith in the welfare state by the 1980s, and they were cut again in the 1990s and thereafter. Wherever budgets were cut, planning went back into the hands of the expert. So in the 1990s, urban planner Nabil Hamdi began to explore map making as a tool for collecting information. With little previous exposure to participatory research community, he saw the map as a method for gathering information on the cheap. And in his book, Houses Without Housing, he outlined a strategy for polling squatters about where to locate toilets. These maps would not fundamentally question the relationship between communities and land and water. Decisions about what to map and what not to map would remain in the hands of the experts. In Hamdi's vision, the planner would become the visionary of slum beautification, collecting data volunteered by the very poor, just as the experts had in Britain in the 1890s. So just as with the toilets mapped by the Harvard students in 2012, the map was an incidental tool, a visual aid justifying the planner's ideal. It was not a diagram for facilitating discussions between the poor about their own future. Discussions about the project's scope and direction were made before consulting with locals, and decisions about what to read in the landscape and how that information should be analyzed likewise remained out of locals' hands. Participatory tools have limits. Historically, they excel in raising local conversations about inclusion and exclusion, self-government, and targeting polluters or lobbying for land rights, but they could not withstand the defunding of organization. When participatory maps reappeared in the West in the 1990s, rumors of global success shaped enthusiastic expectations. In 1995, American Vice President Al Gore argued that digital maps could become a tool for fighting global warming with broadcast consent. Everyone agreed the coming of interactive technologies on the internet promised to undo that dependence on the sociologist or the geographer, who operated as the intermediary between the citizens and the map. So on the internet, a participatory mapping revolution dates from the advent of the mashup in 2004, associated with the O'Reilly Media Web 2.0 conference of that year. In 2004, the open source platform OpenStreetMap appeared, followed by Google Maps 2005 soon thereafter. The promise of these new tools stemmed from the power of the map to transform information from strangers. Unlike the tools of the early 2000s, chat rooms, forums, wikis, blogs, and podcasts, these maps actually analyzed the data given to them, sorting social information into patterns of regional, local, and global significance. The maps do not merely collect information as a memory hole like WikiLeaks does. Rather, the maps show the community back to itself, revealing hotspots of local corruption and pollution, giving activists the tools to target particular places with investigation or protest. And that promise of instant analysis of the people's will earned an enthusiastic greeting from the Western media. when Ushahidi was used to track corruption in India and later to make an emergency relief map in real time for aid workers in Haiti following the earthquake of 2011. Both events were celebrated in mainstream magazines and newspapers, even in venues like Foreign Policy that had almost never to date featured apps. And indeed, in both circumstances, the maps became tools for quick polling with social questions executed at a scale, local detail, and speed that would have been unimaginable a few years before. But what about the implicit claim that maps make the world more democratic? In India, a deeply funded startup called Waterwala promised to deliver water to families that had none. Their solution? A cell phone-based price point survey of what each family would be willing to pay for water delivery. The solution never touched on India's heated politics of aquifer ownership between urban water consumers and highland villagers turned into deserts by the new infrastructure. Maps were a poll of potential prices to tell companies what to do. Public ownership and the commons weren't even on the table. And the counterfactual is important here. If we remember that the majority of participatory maps from the 1980s were designed for the purpose of inquiring into land and water rights. The Waterwala research could have been designed to map where India's water is, where it goes, but it did not. The demographic of the map's facilitators had, after all, changed. In 1978, participatory maps were tools of the activists who had fought for worker cooperatives in South Asia. In 2013, the facilitators were fresh minted MBAs from MIT or Harvard, familiar with price theory. To organizers in 1978, certain roles for the maps were obvious, showing communities their territory, opening up to dispute questions about how the state had allocated land and water and how that might change. Those same goals were less obvious as a social good to the new designers of maps in 2013. Ideas about appropriate technology and participatory facilitation disappeared as well. In 1978, facilitators assumed that their role was to encourage the participation of those excluded on the basis of gender, race, and class. By the 2000s, however, it was routinely assumed that creating an open infrastructure would automatically overcome these exclusions. And those assumptions were maladapted in the extreme in developing countries in Africa and India, where 80% of the population has cell phones, but less than 20% have access to GIS-enabled devices. So in Kibera in 2009, a World Bank-funded project tried to open up city planning with the power of cell phones. A small group of Kiberans, facilitated by a Westerner, mapped their town. No Freudian methods were called in to assemble women or members of the working class. No facilitators asked them to come to consensus over their grievances. No social meetings were called to summon consensus about the use of the map at all. Unsurprisingly, those who contributed visions to the Map Kibera wiki were already government ministers, and what they contributed was landmarks that a Westerner might like to see. Electronic crowdsourced maps could be designed otherwise. They could be paired with tools for facilitating conversations within communities, but typically a mapping platform consists of a poll, not a venue for debating the map's purpose. They do not ask what to map, and as a result, even our crisis maps are stamped with the politics of aid and profit. Our maps are less used for establishing where property lines exist, where they are contested, who pays the most rent, or who has the right to which water reservoirs. Those kinds of information could be designed atop public mapping platforms, but that would be a different world where crowdsourced maps are very different than the ones we now have. The process that was taught by development organizers as the participatory map comes to us from people well beyond Silicon Valley. Indigenous and post-colonial peoples around the world invented the crowdsourced map as their tool. Its chief use was in contesting access to land and water, and Silicon Valley has given us the technologies for making that map scale. If we hearken to the definition of participation advanced by global organizers in the 1970s, what is needed for the participatory map to become a truly revolutionary technology is not very grand, and it can happen through the appropriation of existing technologies as well as the development of new apps. Such a revolution would require engineers dedicated to the service of social movements, a respect for the history of participatory methods, a respect for the long history of struggles by poor people for control over their land and water, and a respect for the time and the energies of the oppressed. Participatory movements around the world already understand the last of these items, respect. And here is transparent Chennai, whom I visited this summer using community college students to combat encroachment of public rights of way by households who are building streets, literally, building buildings, new houses, literally in the middle of the streets, creating cul-de-sacs where none previously existed. They're mapping by hand, trying to figure out if an overall sanitation program or a waste program or a composting program for the entire city of Chennai is possible. And look at what they're doing. They've printed out Google Satellite View, and they're annotating it by hand in pencil, so that their notes can be scanned in and worked over in GIS. So there are two levels of misalignment here. First, Google Maps doesn't mesh with the material realities of places where the GIS-enabled phones are scarce. And second, technologists haven't foregrounded poor people's questions about common ownership of land and water. Even if Google worked on the ground here, there isn't an out-of-the-box technology for tracking encroachments on public rights of way. Historians of the future may look back on this moment as the age of misalignment. A tool wrought by indigenous people, the participatory map finally gained the ability to scale, given a platform by Silicon Valley. Those maps were received with immense enthusiasm at the World Bank, in part because of the decades of analog participatory mapping that had already intervened. Buoyed by decades of official enthusiasm, The Guardian and the New York Times recanted the message that retooling the map was a potential lever for revolution. But by the point the new technology was out of alignment with the poor people's movements who reinvented the map in the first place. The age of misalignment results. One day, perhaps, the engineers will catch up with the revolutionaries.
So thank you, Joe. I hope that there will be questions. And there's also a little bit of food. Those two could go together. So I don't think Joe's finished.
Yeah, so did you look into, you mentioned the Haiti thing a little bit, but did you look into any projects where there was a speed component or something where, like, there was some event that needed to be reacted to quickly, so it didn't just need to be accurate, it needed to be sort of reactive?
It sounds like you have a case in mind.
Well, I mean, hey, so Haiti, I think, is a pretty good one, actually. But I think there are a lot of sort of like disaster response type of stuff. Is there been anything there in terms of stuff that you've seen?
Yeah, from what I've been seeing of the crisis mapping, I mean, my verdict on them, that as I put it here, is that the crisis mapping is indeed marvelous in terms of the amount of data you can collect in a survey of where aid needs to go and time. For the Red Cross, it's amazing. It saves lives. You get water exactly where the water needs to go. You get blood exactly where the blood needs to go. And that does save people. There's absolutely no question about it. The larger question, the political economy question about reversing power as a whole, is not merely a question about how the human helping professions can do their jobs better, but how the entire alignment of money and power in the ruling of our society gets rechanneled. And those are usually in questions about land and water. And the crisis mappers are otherwise consumed. Hank.
I want to ask you about experts. First, this was amazing. But I'm wondering about some of the examples you used. So one of them was the mimeographed advice, where it says one of the do's was go to local insiders
Yes.
before you sort of have a conception of it yourself.
Yes.
And one was, sorry, with the Cree, the data is kept by the shaman
Yes.
and only released when they need to go to court.
Yes.
So is there, it seems like that as power or as authority moved from professional experts,
Yes.
it went to local experts.
Yes.
Not
Yes.
experts in the professional sense, but experts who were given power for local reasons.
Yes.
So how does that jive with the idea of a participatory map?
Yes.
And how do you conceive of that? And
Yes.
how did the activists conceive of that?
Well, we can bend these words in a lot of ways, but when a historian talks about the era of rule by experts, we mean something very specific from that, which is different than other kinds of knowledge that we might decide after the fact or expertise. So kind of local knowledge which was grounded in the fact that I know that this pine tree only grows here because my grandmother grew up on this hillock is very different than the kind of expertise that I get trained in an institution of higher learning and the professions and the disciplinary professions that serve the civil servants of the growing nation state in the 19th century. So by that use of expert, I mean something that is linked to a whole range of vertical institutions.
Does that help?
Yeah, it certainly helps. And if you don't mind, I have a sort of a second question, but just that my concern is that there's a misalignment in the 60s between sort of the community that is being mapped and their authority figure with whom the activists are, who the activists are talking to. That it's possible that they have a different conception than the school teachers or the shamans who are the ones who keep this actual local knowledge.
So the shamans have actually come up for me only when I've been interviewing anthropologists who are working with Aborigines right now, in which they're interested in data architecture and the reality of local prohibitions on knowledge. It might be women's knowledge, it might be shamans' knowledge, but maybe we could investigate this further, but that's what's coming out now. And what I've seen in the archive from the 60s and 70s is a very different set of concerns, and that's the concerns with inclusion that are like breaking up the women and the men on the assumption that there are these universal divisions, but that breaking up the universal divisions to support consensus making by people who have been traditionally impressed is what a facilitator should be doing. It's what the new expertise involves.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Jean, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. It was a great talk, Joe. But I was noticing as you were showing the participatory maps, they tend to, as you said, they tend to be on paper and they tend to not have a base map under them until this one.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you wanted to or could talk a little bit about how people are reacting to the mass availability, well, semi-map, assuming you have a semi-broadband connection to the internet or a GPS-enabled device, the availability of base maps and what is encoded in the base map, like boundary lines between countries that are disputed.
Yes.
But Google made a decision. So anyway.
Yes. No, that is one of the big differences of activism then and now. The lack of a base layer was, in the 70s and 80s, understood as a virtue of the toolkit of participatory mapping, because you didn't assume that there was that there was a reality that this map had to adhere to. This was actually coming out of a whole saga in the discipline of psychology about the invention of the idea of the mental map. The studies that had been done by Ronald Gould and his associates in the early 60s that showed that if you ask children to draw a map of their hometown, that like the candy store is really big and everything else is really small. And that the same thing translates to how fishermen see fishing islands, that the fishing places are really big and the other things are really small. So these freehand diagrams were understood to access different kinds of social, psychological, and cultural content, and to elevate that over traditional norms like instantiated political boundaries. So there's a question here, I think, when we ask our students to experiment with making a map and we recommend that they use Google Maps, for example, we're recommending that they work with a technology whose primary design was to help people navigate to places where they can buy goods or services. That's what it's for. It's very good at that. If you need to find a cup of coffee near where you are right now, you look that up on a cell phone and you're golden. But if you need to look up the spiritual condition of the neighborhood where you are now, like, good luck, good luck. So it's not, so the base layer, I think the base layer masks a whole nother level of conversations about what we want to show. And even this, even this satellite view, as innocent as it seems, is still a network of houses and streets. And it makes no attempt to show you what's under the ground or above the ground in the atmosphere. We could invent all sorts of base layer maps for all sorts of these other shared purposes. And those depend on other received historical realities about how we treat land and water and air and soil and what we think deserves to be shown and what we think the average citizen cares about. Is the average citizen only a consumer, or is the average citizen invested in some of these more invisible, immutable things? That's I think, the question of where these maps are now in the developing world. Naka.
Great talk. So if you wanted to answer your question, can maps save the world? So your answer would be, they can't, but not really. Something like that, because what you're showing is that these are tools of modernity that kind of travel around the world or what have you. You have this moment in the 70s that's very, almost like, we can almost predict with the 70s that there's this moment and now it's gone, right? So my question is twofold. First of all, is like, what is sort of your historiographic sort of like intervention on one hand, because you get a chance to give us that answer. And then the other one is like, what is the political sort of stake? In the sense, behind all that is this critique of capitalism, but beyond what? So you show this map that shows some sort of possibility of some sort of activism. So I was just wondering, like, beyond the sort of scholarly, I'm going to do this. Yes. What's the other political stake that you have in your project?
Yes. Well, let me start with where you started, which is maps can save the world, but not really. I mean, this is maybe a temperamental question at the end of it, but my answer would be, it's an age of misalignment. They can save the world. They have saved amazing things so far, but there's a disjoint between the head and the heart. There's the head and the hands. They aren't communicating. The anthropologists know all sorts of things. The computer scientists never talk to them. But if they got together, all the amazing things they could do.
But you're saying it, though, the political continuity doesn't really allow that to happen so easily. So that's kind of like, yeah, they can.
Well, these are the tragedies of history, and also one of the uses of historians is that we're sometimes responsible for pointing out to what sorts of dead ends we have worked ourselves. So you ask about the historiography. I mean, where the historiography mainly takes us is that the same generation of Marxist development workers at the University of Sussex who starts rethinking the map, they come alongside at exactly the same point is when my fellow historians of Britain and historians of France and historians of America start going into the map archives and re-looking at the map archives as a tool of empire. So this historiography, putting them together into a moment of the imperial map and then a moment of undoing the map, is actually, beautifully, that's a process that's being worked out by historians and art activists of the same generation coming to understand the time in which they are living.
Picking up on that a little bit, you've fantastic talk, super interesting. Alluded a couple of times to the University of Sussex, to organization, and then also to the sort of moment in the 70s and 80s in Britain that these programs are defunded. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the way these sort of global movements are organized. Is this kind of a centered thing in because yes. You're making the point that British Marxism sort of catches up to it, but yes. It seems like organizationally, does it come to depend on British academics, or
yes.
I'm wondering if you could draw the kind of
yes.
global organization a little more, because it seemed to pop up a couple of times.
Yes, it's an interesting issue. It's an interesting issue because it's a world of centers and a world of nonprofits and local movements, which then hooks up to academia. And the hope is that academia can broaden these conversations and can attract more funding and more power at scale. And in fact, that is exactly what happens. The academics at the University of Sussex write lots of articles in World Development. They get published, they publish books, they get recognized. Their students become officials at the World Bank and the United Nations. And that secures whole buckets of funding for the nonprofits to continue their work. It helps to highlight them. It helps to attract the mandate of the government of India. And this is one of the reasons that things spread and spread and boil over in the 1990s. And that the world stands ready and at attention when the mashup appears. Finally, we dreamed of this moment. Now it's here. But those institutions are fickle and have other purposes. And this is, to my mind, part of the drama of the institutional history of this project. Yeah, is thinking through our answer to can participatory maps save the world has a lot to do with the security of the institutions we think have to be around in order to get the people in the room who we want to talk to. A question in the back?
Yeah, I noticed that most of your examples were kind of collaborative maps, a lot of people working together on one map, but there's also some examples we had where it's like one person making a map and sharing with many people. And it seems like the technology we have today makes it a lot easier for one person to make a really compelling map, but not so much for people to work together on a map. Is there kind of a distinction between the maps that a single person makes for other people versus maps that as a community will participate together and make?
So I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, in a wonderful way, that like the reason we can make so bold a claim is to say, well, maybe participatory maps can save the world. Is that this instance of collaboration of the many-to-many map which was once made by drawing in the dirt and then transferring that map to a piece of paper to circulate wherever it needed to go, is now translated to the computer screen, and you can make a many-to-many map. So that one of those early images that I showed, which was the LEO network in Alaska, which my student Katie Parker helped to find, that it's a many-to-many map. It's members of an indigenous peoples network who are constantly monitoring the environmental condition around Alaska and sharing information. So it's not just one person. It can be an organization. It can be an ongoing effort, and that's part of the potentiality, the massive potentiality of these new technologies that simply didn't exist before. The fact that you can have a placeholder and that it can evolve over time and accrete over time, that was something that did require an institution. I have one more question, and then maybe then we should exploit the rest, what remains of the buffet.
Great talk. So it struck me that many of your examples were either rural or in sort of low-rise urban environments, and I was wondering how the conversation might change in sort of high-rise urban environments, for instance in New York or Toronto or wherever.
Yes. Yes, it's an interesting question because Google Satellite View, again, doesn't show the depth under the field. It would show you the top of the building and not the many, many layers underneath. And it would be another instance where you would need a retooling of the map to show the purposes of the neighborhood. Something for the designers of the future. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate your time.